Okay, so let's go ahead and start in through chapter 1 here. So when we talk about the process view of an organization, basically a process is when you transform inputs into outputs. It's that simple, okay? So an example can be a single stage in automobile assembly line, okay? So think about where the seats might be installed, right? You're transforming those inputs, which would be the seats and the car, into something different, okay? Or the process view could also say, I want to look at the bigger picture, and I want to look at that entire assembly line. And you could look at that entire assembly line as a process. And so what we do is, one of the things that's important is that you have to define the boundaries of what you're looking at, because the process can extend all the way from the raw materials coming from the ground to the return cycle of the person that finishes using that product. And so we have to set boundaries to say, but this is the area that we're focusing on, okay? And again, with continuous improvement, it's about making things better. It's not about making them perfect, okay? And so that's kind of continuous improvement is we're looking at this segment of the process and how can we make improvements on that particular segment of the process. Okay, so the process view of organizations considers any organization to be a process that consists of interconnected sub-processes. Okay, and so one of the keys to working on process improvement is to define those boundaries. So are we looking at one stage? Are we looking at several stages? And that's going to be part of your initial project, is to say, this is what I want to look at, and I'm going to look at it from the point that this happens to the point that this happens, because you have to be intentional about where you're going to focus your efforts. Okay, there are basically 5 elements of a process. Okay, and there'll be slides on each of these, and I post these slides too, so you have access to those. There are inputs and outputs into the process. There are the flow unit, what actually moves through the process. Okay, we have a network of both activities and buffers. That is what the process consists of. And we have resources, which are the things that we use. So resources can be equipment, resources can be people, right? And we have information structure. We have to get the communication to it somehow, okay? So if we talk about just inputs and outputs, so inputs are going to be any tangible or intangible items that flow into the process, okay? So tangible can be raw materials, component parts, energy. Intangible can be information. Okay. Outputs are any tangible or intangible items that flow from the process back into the environment. Okay. So think about finished products or pollution is an output, right? Maybe not a desirable one, but it is an output of a process, or can be. Intangible, again, is going to be that processed information or a satisfied customer. Okay. And so the inputs and outputs actually shape how that organization interacts with the environment. Okay. We're going to talk a lot about a flow unit, and so it's important that you understand the terminology. The flow unit just means, what is it that you're analyzing? What's the unit that you're analyzing? And I can give you some examples of when you could have the same process, but you could be looking at 2 different flow units. So if you think about the lady that did the Papa John's driver check-in process, one flow unit is the driver themselves going through the process, right? So you could look at that flow unit and say that's what we're going to focus on. Another flow unit is the actual paperwork that's associated with it, right? He gets to turn in his logs, how's that information processed, right? And so that can be a flow unit in the process as well. And so sometimes what you're going to find is when you start to analyze your process, you may need to do 2 different flow units, and they're going to have 2 different sets of timings that go with them, because what happens with the driver can be separate than what happens with the logs and the information. Okay, so the flow unit can also be the financial value of the input or the output. One of the kind of the most illuminating things to me is later on, I think in chapter 3, we'll do some flow unit analysis of dollars, just looking at financial statements and the things that, if you're savvy enough to use that to look and see where you have the most opportunity in your business, probably to make some improvements. Okay. All right, so it says review table 1.1 on page 4. So I'll flip to page 4. And so some examples of some generic business processes, some flow units, orders themselves. So if you think about the time a customer places an order till the time they receive an order, products from the time that you start assembling it till you deliver it to the customer. And again, you can narrow that down. Maybe it's from the time that the raw materials arrive on the production line till you have a finished unit coming off of the production line. Supplies, customers themselves, and cash can all be different types of flow units that you could use. Okay. So another example, if you were thinking about Amazon's warehouse flow, right? You could look at maybe the books that they have. How long does it take for a book to enter that warehouse till it exits the warehouse? You could look at the customer order. How long does it take till they receive the customer order until they ship the customer order? Or you could look at dollars. How long does it take before they, when they invest in a book, till they receive their return dollars on that book? Okay, so you can look at kind of in a variety of ways. Okay, so the third step in taking a look at this process view is you need to think about the network of activities and buffers. Okay, so an activity is going to be the simplest form of transformation, and it is a building block of a process. So oftentimes if we're looking at a whole production line, we would say maybe each workstation represents an activity. Okay, but within that workstation, you know that there are other things that are happening, but we're just going to say that's going to be the activity block that we're going to look at. Okay, if I'm again looking at an entire production line, maybe that's where I'm going to start. It's just with each work center being an activity. If I decide that I want to focus specifically on that work center, then I'm going to break it down and I'm going to say every activity that happens in that work center is going to be represented by an individual step. Okay, and so that process view is very flexible depending on what it is that you need to analyze and evaluate. Okay, these activities are linked so that the output of one becomes the input of another, and often that happens through an intermediate buffer. Okay, and when we say buffer, basically we're saying that inventory is stored in between, and I like to think of it initially, let's just think of it as a production line, because that's going to be the easiest way for you to grasp it. That I have a work center, and oftentimes I might have buffer between this work center, buffer, and the next work center. Okay, and so inventory is the total number of flow units within the process boundaries that we define. Okay, so all of that's going to seem a little like a lot to try to engage with right away, but as we work through it, it'll come together for it. All right. So the fourth step in adopting a process view, and we get into this in, I think, chapter 5 of the text, is identifying the resources that we use in the process. Okay, they are usually tangible, and we can divide them into two basic categories: capital and labor. Okay, so you think about the equipment that you need and the people that you need, right, to do the process. And resources facilitate the transformation of inputs into outputs during the process. Okay, so some activities, and we'll get into this in chapter 5, require multiple resources. So a welding activity requires both a worker and a welding gun. Okay, some resources perform multiple activities. So an employee might both weld and drill. Right? And so we have to be intentional about what pieces we're looking at and how we're going to address that. Okay? And the fifth step is we need to identify what the information structure is. And it shows what information is needed and available in order to perform activities and make those managerial decisions. Okay? All right, so here's kind of your first view of kind of when you start to diagram a process, what it should look like. And you can either draw the big rectangle or mentally know that it's there, and that represents the boundaries of what you're going to look at. Okay, so this rectangle represents the boundaries of what you're going to look at. So here's the boundary of what we're going to look at, and then we have our inputs, which are coming into the process, and you typically represent those with arrows coming into the process, right? And then what comes out is also represented, so your outputs are going to be represented by an arrow too. Inside your diagram, right, is where you have your network of your activities and your buffers. And this is, you'll need to know this, and we'll study it again in chapter 3 or 4. But rectangles represent activities, right? Triangles represent buffers. So you can see in our process diagram, we have activity, buffer, activity, buffer, activity. Okay? A lot of times when I draw my processes, that's especially if it's a physical unit, it looks a lot like that. It looks like, okay, we do something and then it waits. We do something and then it waits. We do something and then it waits. Okay. And you have your resources coming in, which are both your labor and capital, which we don't necessarily show on the map, but we actually do, like I said, when we get to Chapter 5, we start to analyze that. Okay. And again, a business process is a network of activities separated by buffers and performed by resources that transforms inputs into outputs. Okay? The process design that we focus on specifies the structure of that business process in terms of inputs, outputs, and that network of activities and buffers. So process flow management is therefore a set of managerial policies that specify how a process should be operated over time. Okay? And which resources we should use to do that. Okay, so a process view is applicable to manufacturing processes, and to me, when you're first starting out thinking about processes, that's the easiest when you've got physical flows that you can think about. Okay, you can also, it applies to services, accounts receivable department, product design teams, computer rental companies, hospitals. In truth, any product or service can be viewed through a process perspective. Okay, so let's think about that for a minute. Have any of you had any brief flashes of something that you think, okay, I think this might be a good idea for my project this semester? Anybody had anything come to mind as we've talked about that? Abby?
The company I work for back home, the way we do our inventory.
Okay.
It's awful.
Okay, and see, that's the perfect. When you go, oh my gosh, we are terrible at this, right? That's a great place to start to say, how can we do that better, okay? So let's just talk about that for a quick second and how we might think of that in a process view. So if you were going to say, at what point do you think you should start looking at that till how do you do your inventory today? Can you give us a quick description?
Well, we just did it right before I came back to school, and it's a mandatory thing. We all have to come in on either Friday afternoon or Saturday, and it's I'm not sure somebody else does it's a printed off thing, they do it through the computer, and it's a whole generated list, and we basically go and we split off into teams and count everything in our warehouse. Mm-hmm. And it's always a jumbled mess, and then they bring it back to me and a couple other people, and we have to enter it into our computer, and we run the variants, and then after they do that, they have to find everything that's missing, and then that's another 4-hour process.
So when you do that, do you do inventory counts throughout the year, or is it just kind of that one big one?
We do one big one, and then it's usually a process of we try to keep track of what's there, but it never works out.
Yeah. So because I think there are some tools that can be used that could help that. So Pella does something similar in that we have to count. There's a financial responsibility that you have to count everything at one time of the year. So we shut down production and come in and count. I say we as though I still work there, because I did it for 9 years, right? So, you're right, that part isn't a lot of fun, but what makes it better is if it's relatively accurate before you go into that.
Ours is never accurate.
Yeah, and so then it's how do you focus on making those improvements to make sure that it's more accurate as it goes on. So I think that's good. So from the time that so we can talk about maybe what your scope wants to be. So that could be an interesting project. Anybody else had any ideas? Yeah.
I work for a company out of Paducah that manufactures a lot of different equipment. And I was going to look into maybe making some of our processes a little bit more efficient.
Yeah. So what I would do with that is I would pick something that, again, you go, oh my gosh, we're not very good at that, right? Those are the ones that are the low-hanging fruit is what we call those. And so pick something that appears to be something that really isn't working well, and that you have access to. So that's kind of the other thing, because you'll need to be able to take some timings and document the flow of the process. So what kind of equipment do you make?
It's mining and heavy materials.
Okay. Equipment that goes with that industry?
Yeah, it's different conveyor equipment, belt cleaners, belt scales,
Mm-hmm.
metal detectors, things like that. It's actually a family business, so I mean, I can get anything I need. But
So one of the things that you could do is, if you think that there's one particular production line that is a problem, or one particular piece of equipment, you might start with this bigger picture and say, here's how I'm going to map that out. And what you'll find is, then you may narrow down and say, but I think it's this particular activity step that's the problem, and you can dive deeper on that particular piece of it. And the reason I want to talk to you about that is, like, Pella will do a whole production line, but we'll have 20 people on a team that will do it in 1 week, right? And that's all we focus on for that week. Is we start out the week and we probably already have some timings. We do some training at the beginning, like Monday morning, and then you start identifying and mapping out the process, which really is the extent of what we're going to do in this class, is just identifying the problem and where the waste is at. Because in most cases, we won't have the ability to go in and actually fix it, right? Mm-hmm. You can report that back to the people that you work for, the companies that you're talking about, and they may choose to implement it, but we really won't have the implementation piece here. I mean, I think it's the value of what we're going to provide is this is where we see the problem, this is the waste that we've identified, and make recommendations on what we think we could do differently, right? So that's the goal of what we're going to try to do, is get from identifying that waste. And Pella, and a team of 15 or 20 people, usually does that in about 2.5 days. So by Wednesday, and I'm not kidding, and so you'll probably experience some of this in your project. We call it hump day for a variety of reasons, but Wednesday is usually pretty painful for those continuous improvement teams, because at that point everybody's got an idea of what they think needs to happen. So you've got this team of 15 or 20 people, which you'll be dealing with mostly you, right? But everybody thinks they know so you'll have maybe 3 or 4 kind of differing opinions about where you should go, and you've got to get there by Friday. That's the goal of this continuous improvement team. And they've allocated resources to come in and actually make changes on the production line based on what the team comes up with. And so they have engineering resources and they have maintenance resources, and so, to kind of move and change everything around. And so that's kind of that. Some of those things that we've done with that have been incredibly cool. One of the things that seemed counterintuitive to me is we had a production line in Story City that ran, I can't remember what the rate was, but we slowed it down by almost 2/3, right? And you would think that would be a bad idea. But it wasn't, because what we did is we connected onto the end of the line. That line did venting window units, and we connected onto it kind of a split, and so one part would do venting units and the other part would do fixed units. And then they would come together at the end and either go off as single units, or we would put them in composites, right? And so by slowing that line down to be able to do the composites in flow, right, we took out this process of, we were making those individual units on other production lines, then you put them up in storage, right, and they have to be packaged and wrapped to go into storage. They don't have to have the pretty packaging, but they have to have brown cardboard and shrink wrap, so you've got that expense. You've got the expense of somebody picking them up and moving them into storage. You've got the expense of somebody scheduling them out of storage and back to a composite production line, right? Then you've got the composite production line that's separate from everybody else, and so now they're putting that together, and then they wrap them in final packaging and then ship them out. And I think, by combining that and slowing that down, I think we were able to save almost $150,000 a year, right? And so, but that seems counterintuitive, like, slowing a production line down? No, you want to go faster, right? Faster is better. Not always. In that same vein, we worked with the double hung, they have balances in them. So, when you open a window, it's got a balance inside that makes it easier to open on those double hung windows, right? And so these balances, have I told you the story already? These balances come in, they came in these great big crates, right? And those crates are open, and so what we had is, think of like this classroom times 3 with crates of different sizes of balances in them. And we had what's called a water spider, which is somebody that feeds parts to a production line. And that water spider would have a list of, this is what the production is, and they would go out and they would go, okay, well, I need 2 of these in this slot, and I need 2 of these in this slot, and they'd go down and pick and stage for that production line, okay? And we went to the supplier, and we had a continuous improvement event with the supplier. and we were able to slow their production down so that they could produce in sequence for what we were going to do on our production line. So we eliminated 3 classrooms full of parts that we had, right, to just some single boxes of safety stock that we needed to have on hand. And our supplier then produced in sequence and loaded carts up so that when it rolled off of the production line, we had to stage the carts, then we could just roll them right up to the production line when they were ready to work on them. And again, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings by the time you think about all of the inventory that we had, right? And it was a win for our supplier because we shared that cost improvement. So we paid them more for them to do that, and it actually was, in the entire system, it was a win for them and it was a win for us too, because then they didn't have to have all of that inventory. I mean, that's the other thing. We had that stockroom of inventory and they had that stockroom of inventory, right? And so it's that kind of, and oh, by the way, we probably had 4 water spiders that were picking parts on a regular basis, right? And so those 4 water spiders are no longer responsible for that, and they can do other things. So here's my question. If you're on a continuous improvement team, right, and you make improvements that reduces your labor, what happens to the people that you don't need them in those roles anymore? What do you do with those people?
Kind of depends on the people.
Okay.
Because, I mean, if somebody's a welder, they're not going to go sell a bunch of stuff or run your marketing department. But, I mean,
so
depending on what it is, you can use them for something else.
Okay. All right. So typically were any of you thinking, well, we have to lay them off? Did that cross your mind? No? No? That's good. It should not cross your mind. And here's why. In my 343 class, when we do that Lego training, it inevitably crosses people's mind that, okay, well, we need to lay people off because we've improved our process. We went from needing 8 people down to needing 1, so 7 people are going to be out of the job, right? Think about so on these continuous improvement teams, it's typically, so I'll give the pellet example. It's typically a manager from first or third shift, right? And then the lead from the opposite shift. So you have managerial representation from both shifts, because I don't know if any of you have ever worked in shift environments. Anybody done that? And it can be pretty competitive and pretty non-cooperative, right? And so having that managerial influence from both first and third shift, and oh, by the way, operators from both first and third shift, right? And then typically somebody who's skilled at continuous improvement, somebody who has no idea about what this process is and why they do it, because you need somebody to ask the questions of, why do you do it that way, right? And you need to be able to explain and emphasize that. And then usually you kind of fill in with maybe some folks that are maybe more experienced with lean and kind of help promote what's going on with the team. But if you have those operators, and I have to tell you, one of the things that I learned and was amazed at was, like, I would go into these events as the manager of a production line, and I would think I knew what happened on my production line. I mean, I would feel confident walking in there. And we'd be walking through, outlining the steps, and I'd go, okay, and then it's like this, and the operator would go, well, no, not really. Here's what we do. And it's like, oh. I mean, we have standard work, and it says this is what we're going to do, right? And we say we're going to do standard work, and then the operator says, well, sort of, but this is how we really do that, right? And so then that's why you have the operators there, because managers think we know the answers, right? And what I learned through experience is I needed to shut up and let them talk, because they're the ones that really know, right? And so you let them be the experts. But if they're the experts, and their impression is that if we improve efficiency, that means that 3 of the people that I work with on my production line aren't going to be on my production line anymore. What's my incentive, right? If I think they're going to get fired, why would I ever want to help this continuous improvement team? And so you have to establish that change is okay, right? And that not that it's okay. Change is a part of our routine. And as an operator on a production line, I am not guaranteed and don't need to think that I'm going to be on this production line for the next 20 years. Because if that's our mentality, it's really hard to drive the improvement process, right? And so how do you drive that flexibility? And the way that Pella chooses to drive it is they do profit sharing, right? And I don't know where they've been in the last, I've been away from Pella for 6 or 7 years, but I received from 1994 until 2003, the lowest I ever received was 14% of my income in profit sharing every year. Maybe it was down to 11 one year. But most of the time, it was 18 or 19%, right, of my income was added into my retirement because of their profit sharing program, right? And that's a pretty big deal. And it's not, and I'm telling you, it's not that I wasn't paid appropriately to begin with. And so that drives people's behavior, right, especially over longer term, right? We have trouble with that at the Murray plant, at least when I was there, because how many plant closures have been in this area, right? And so we would interview people, and we would be like, we'd be telling the Pella story about how they've never closed a plant, and you know, and these are people that have been through 3 plant closings, and they're like, yeah, whatever, you know. So just tell me about what you're going to pay me and how you're going to pay me, because they have no faith that it's going to be there. And interestingly enough, then in 2009, Pella closed its first plant. So, you know, they no longer can tell the story of we've never closed a facility. They closed one in almost 100 years. So I still think that's a pretty good record. But and interestingly, it was the plant that I was at in Story City that got closed. So if we had stayed in Story City, I would have been doing something very different. So again, just a little bit of, you know, as we're talking about, as we're going through the next few chapters here, be thinking about where, you know, what process you think might work for your project. And then, but I wanted to kind of hit, so Abby, when I think about the flow unit that you might use, so your inventory accuracy is what you're kind of most interested in. And so it's going to be the process of how you, so we'll have to think about the flow unit. It's not actually the inventory itself, it's that reconciliation of the inventory report.
Yeah.
But driving into that is what feeds into your inventory inaccuracies. So you might have, again, 2 flow units. One of them might be the reporting process, and one of them might be what are the steps that are in order to receive an input and put away, and then and we can talk about that some. And so in your case, you might again start with that, the product being your flow unit, but your process boundaries may start here while you try to figure out the best place to focus on, and then your project may end up maybe just with more of a specific focus. Okay? All right. So value stream mapping or value chain mapping is another tool that's used to map the network of activities and factors in a process, identifying the activities that add value and those that are waiting and those that are wasteful. A couple of stories. You have people that really believe in lean and some that believe in some of the tools and not all of the tools. Pella at one point did value stream mapping like every other year and tried to look at 10 years out, right? What do you think the problem with that is in today's marketplace? What's that?
I was just thinking about the question.
Yeah, so what do you think the problem is in today's marketplace?
There's too much change for that.
Yeah, exactly. So the reality is you cannot, I can't say you cannot, but it's much more difficult in today's environment to look out for 10 years and to think that you really have an accurate picture. I can remember about the 3rd year we did it, I worked for a plant manager, it was like, this is a waste of our time. You know, we did it a year ago, we saw the opportunity, we need to be focused on what we're going to do in the next 3 years. You know, that's where we need to focus our time. And so you need to select, the tools are there, and some of them, I think it's valuable to look at, but again, I think that every year or every other year looking at it, I think you're probably losing something in the translation there because you really don't know that far out. But what it does is it helps you put up, so what we would do is we'd have like a wall like this, and we would put up from the time that we received the customer order until the time that the customer received it, we'd have little sticky notes with all of the different things that happened, right, that represented that. We would identify what we would see as the largest areas of waste, and we would say, okay, this is what we're going to focus on, and how are we going to do that? So that's one approach to it. Another approach to it in terms of determining what you're going to work on is you invite, and typically it was managers and leads. I mean, employees could input as well. them to make suggestions for teams that that we want to focus on in the next year. Okay? And so if you were going to propose that, there's just a sheet of paper, and you describe it, and you identify what the impact is, or what you believe the impact of that would be. What we would do is we would put those up in a room, and all managers could walk in, and you had three stickers, and you got to vote for 3 projects that you thought were the most important. And so at the end of the day, those managers are deciding which ones influence the plant in the most positive aspect, and that's how they started to prioritize which ones had the most to which ones have the least, right? So like I could have a project that I think is really important for my line, but it doesn't necessarily make that big of an impact on the entire plant. And so then the conversation becomes, we're not going to do this as a plant team, but how can you find the resources to do that within your team, right? If that's that important to you. Okay. So the process view highlights that every organization is a connection of interconnected processes. Filling a customer order at Amazon involves things like the order taking process, right? It involves picking and packing, and it involves shipping. Okay? So a value stream map allows users to see all of those, and that the success of an organization requires alignment of efforts across that. Because sometimes you'll find you try not to have the silo approach in continuous improvement, where if I make an improvement, I'm just pushing it away, I'm pushing my problem on someone else. That's not really an improvement, right? If I do something at my production line and it pushes inventory back to my supplier, right? While it is beneficial for my plant, I am not helping the supply chain, and I'm not actually reducing costs in the entire supply chain. Okay, and so our process view is our main tool for evaluating the process and the future goals that we have that are expressed by the firm strategy. So when we start to think about performance measures and what determines the effectiveness of a process, evaluation and measurement of the firm's current and past performance is one way, and future goals can be expressed by a firm strategy. So in order to assess and improve the performance of a business process, we have to make sure that we can measure it in quantifiable terms. So we're going to identify several quantifiable measures for a process in the next little bit. So the importance of managing by fact. How many of you have heard, "In God we trust, all others bring data"? So that's a pretty common saying in industry, right? We used to joke at the Story City plant, everybody would get excited about their project. I've got a huge project, right? So we quantified huge, right? Huge had to be 500,000 or larger. Otherwise, you couldn't call it a huge project, right? It was a project. It wasn't a huge project, right? And so, again, you have to learn how we're going to quantify. So a professional manager is defined as someone who manages by fact rather than intuition or emotion, okay? And the reason that that's important, I had in this class probably 2 or 3 years ago, I had a young lady who was opening her own restaurant. She was amazing, right? And she was going to do a great job with it. But in terms of processes and outlining things, she was more intuitive, right? She would just do things intuitively, which is not bad, especially if you're in a small business and it's just you, right? Because she just knew this wasn't right, so I'm going to fix it, right? Or this wasn't right, I'm going to fix it. But if you're in a larger organization, you have to be able to communicate that to other people and sell your story about why it's important to do what we're going to do. And that's what we do in this class, is we transfer some of what you might know, Abby, about your process intuitively. This is wrong and this is what we need to do. We're going to help you document it and show here's why we need to do that. Okay? And so, again, that's the difference between managing by intuition and managing by data. And I'm very much a data-driven person. I know you're surprised at that. But I have a friend that I managed with at the transportation company that I used to work at, and she was very intuitive. And we would be standing there talking about something, and she would go, right, so to do that, I'm going to need an extra salesperson and this, that, and the other. And I'd be like, Janice, how can you know that? We haven't even done the analysis yet. And she's like, well, And so that night, we went back to the hotel room. It was something that we were working on for our region. And we went back to the hotel room, and I went through all of the steps, to analyze and go through it. And she talked through what she was thinking, and we were very close to each other. So some of it people with intuition, it's because they have the experience and the time there to be able to say, that's how it works, right? So don't discount intuition, but understand if you're trying to express why things are important to other people, that may not be your best approach. Okay? So we have some different types of measures. We can use financial measures, external measures, or internal measures. So financial performance is based on the difference between the value that outputs of the process provide to customers and their cost of production and delivery. And therefore, process management requires external measures that track customer expectations. And then we need internal measures that gauge the effectiveness of our process in meeting them. So external measures indicate how, excuse me, they indicate how customers view the organization's products and services, and internal measures identify areas where the process is performing well and areas where improvement is necessary. Okay, and we'll talk about kind of why that's important that we have both of those. So financial measures first. So what defines a good process? Okay, so our financial measures track that difference between the value provided to the customers and our cost of producing and delivering the product or service. Okay, the goal of every organization is to maximize the difference between the value that we provide to customers and that cost of producing and delivering the product or service. Okay, so not-for-profit organizations generally leave a large part of the difference with their clients, and they use the rest to maintain their viability and growth. So has anybody in here started to read the goal yet? Okay, so have you gotten to the part where they talk about what the goal of a business is? So do you remember what that was?
That was like chapter 3.
So do you remember what they indicated the goal was? It's okay if you don't, but.
Was that the part where he was talking to the other guy about it, or like when they actually established his own?
So he talks to the other guy, but you'll find he kind of, what's the plant manager's name again?
Alex.
Alex. So Alex ends up, he talks to his, guru quite a bit, but the guru keeps going, no, you figure it out, right? I'll give you some questions, but you have to figure out how to do it.
I don't think I've gotten to the part yet where he comes up with his own goal then.
Okay, so in the goal, they identify that the basic goal of any business is to make money, right? I mean, and Alex originally, as you read through it, he's going to try to come up with a bunch of other things, but it distills down to, if you're not doing that, you're not going to stay in business and you're not going to be viable over the long term. So that's the goal of any business. So that's the first part of your project, right? You're asked to define what's the goal of your company. Well, in terms of the goal, it's to make money, right? Okay, some of you are going to choose a nonprofit organization to do, okay? So then their goal has to be defined something slightly different, right? So in terms of financial performance, kind of how I've adapted what we learn in the goal to a nonprofit is to say their goal is to make the most effective use of their resources, right? Because if I do a better job of using my resources, then I can do more for more people. And if that's the goal of a nonprofit, right, that's how we're going to kind of tie that together. Okay? So although financial measures are the ultimate judge of process performance, they're inherently lagging behind what we do, right? So, for example, if I work on a production line and I bonus my folks off of, or if I own a company that has production lines, and I bonus my team off of returns and allowances, right? And I have a 10-year warranty, right? And so the teams that are working on the production lines today are going to be penalized if I get a return for something that was built 9 years ago, right? That translates to them taking ownership of that. Probably not very well. If you think of what would you do differently? What would you do to maybe instead of returns and allowances, what are things that you could measure and incentivize off of that aren't returns and allowances that happen in the manufacturing plant? So if you're trying to get at reducing returns and allowances, what might you do? Any thoughts? No? So Blake, right? So Blake, in your manufacturing environment, Do you have any quality measures that people have to follow that you try to measure?
Yeah, like it's kind of hard to explain because it's not real concrete. But as far as like certain standards have to be upheld, but there's not really like a definition of what that is. Everyone just kind of knows from being around, because everybody that's worked there has worked there for, I think the shortest person's worked there for 14 years.
Okay.
So
they understand what needs to be done.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you can do is trying to translate this returns and allowances, because, I mean, seriously, if I get penalized for somebody that returned something that was built 9 years ago, that just doesn't really feel quite right, right? But if I'm on the production floor and we have quality guidelines and we do inspections of products on a regular basis and they pass inspection, and so maybe it's this percentage of products that need to pass inspection, right? And so, and there's typically some statistical rationale for how many products you may pull off of a production line and inspect, right? And so that's immediate, right? This is what I did today. This is what my team did today. And if they're incentivized off of that, there's some peer pressure to make sure that you get it right, okay? Safety, right, is another issue. So if you're trying to incentivize for safety, right, incentivizing on things like, so you do safety training, and so Troy, I do safety training last week, and this week I'm going to come out and ask you about the 3 key points from that safety training. And if you can't answer that, that's a ding for the entire plant. Do you think there's some pressure for people to pay attention in safety training? Yes. Right? And if you don't do that, what do you think safety training can become? Right? A 15-minute break that just is kind of, we get to sit here and just relax and snooze through it, right? And so you establish and link that importance, okay? And so, again, financial measures are important, and businesses don't survive without understanding what their financial measures are. But if you're trying to apply that to what matters at a plant level, you have to bring it down to the plant level. What is happening today that we can measure that? So what defines a good process, okay? Delivered value of the process, where the benefit to process customers is greater than that total process cost, okay? So ultimately, we care about financial measures, but what's going to lead to that good financial performance is what are we offering in the marketplace in terms of fast service? How much does it cost? What kind of variety do I offer? What's going to lead to good financial performance? If you have a good strategic position and you execute it well, then your financial measures will reflect it.
On the last slide, do we need to know those formulas? Like, are we going to use those?
When I get ready to do the exam review, I'll let you know. I don't think those formulas, no, you won't. Okay? And then, so then we say the benefit is driven by what customer value we're providing. So once you start thinking about what's a good strategic position, then you can start to think about what dimensions of your operation matter, and how are you going to, in a broader sense, what financial measures are you going to use to track the difference between the value provided to the customer and that of producing and delivering the product. Okay? So again, the goal of every organization is to maximize that difference. So for profit maximizing firms, the key measure is profit. For nonprofit, the key financial is the value provided to its clients given a particular budget constraint. So to improve financial performance, you have to attract and retain customers, right? And if any of you have done any marketing, you know that it's a whole lot less expensive to keep your current customers happy and satisfied than it is to go out and find new customers, right? And so we're going to think of this strategic position in terms of how are we identifying what our customers want, and how are we operationally going to deliver that? And what we're going to find in chapters 1 and 2 is how what we do in the marketplace, how we have to tie that into what we're going to do operationally. So if we concentrate on the benefits to the customer, then these are driven by strategic position in terms of price, quality, time, and variety. So if we think of attributes that matter to our customer, it's price, quality, time, and variety. And so once we identify what matters to our customer in those 4 categories, then we can tie those to 4 operational measures for process attributes. Okay? So our external measures track our customer expectations in terms of product or service cost, response time, variety, as well as customer satisfaction. Measures that track dissatisfaction with a product are also good external measures. While the number of customer complaints is a direct measure of customer dissatisfaction, research shows us that only about 4% of dissatisfied customers bother to explain. So you need to kind of blow that number up and go, if we're getting complaints, it's going to be larger than what, the issue is larger than what we're seeing. Okay? External measures are typically from the customer's perspective. Internal measures are those that we use within the organization to drive our behaviors to match the needs of the customer. So like I said, rather than returns and allowances, maybe it's product inspections. Or in other words, internal measures tie to external measures, thereby linking our operation process to what our customer needs. Okay? And we need those internal measures because a process manager doesn't directly control those external financial measures. And you're trying to drive that feeling of I have control over my destiny because of what I do today in the manufacturing environment. Okay? All right, so next up, we talk about that benefit in terms of price, quality, time, and variety. Right? Price is how much does it cost the customer. Quality can be of the product or the outcome or of the service. Time can be in two elements typically. Reliability, right? Do you deliver what you say you're going to deliver when you say you're going to deliver it? And rapid is in terms of how fast. Okay? So a couple of examples from the Pella environment. When I started working at the custom plant, they had just gone from an unlimited lead time for custom product, meaning you would have to call me and say, I want to order this, and I would go, right, we can have that for you in 6 weeks, right? To the environment where they said, nope, we're going to do every custom product that we offer in 15 days. We're going to deliver it in 15 days from the day that we get the order, okay? That's the rapid part of it, okay? The reliability part of it becomes, okay, not only are we going to do that, but we're going to deliver what you order in full, right, more than 98% of the time, okay? And so that's the reliable part, right? And if you're a contractor, think how that matters. So if you can't count on a company to deliver when you say you're going to deliver, you may have to order your windows maybe a week early, right? And so let's say they show up a week early, right? So now you have windows sitting around a housing site, construction site, and they're going to get broken, right? And so that reliability of saying, you want them delivered on the 3rd, 98% of the time, we're going to deliver them on the 3rd, right? And we're going to deliver everything that you ordered on the 3rd, okay? That matters and that matters in that business environment. Okay, and then flexibility, what's the variety of product offering that you have? What is it that you give to me, okay? So our internal measures have to be linked to those external measures that the customer thinks is important. They have to be directly controllable by the process manager. Okay? And so products and product attributes. So from the customer standpoint, these are what we're talking about. Product cost, time, variety, and quality. So you've seen that. You saw that on that other slide. You might think that could be some of the questions that you have in today's assignment. Okay? So if those are important to us from the external side, from the customer side, then from the internal side, it matters. If cost is important, I need to make sure that I'm focusing on a low-cost production environment, right? If response time is important, then I need to think about the flow time. How long does it take when I get the order till I'm able to deliver it? If variety is important to my customer, then I need to think about flexibility. Okay? If quality is important, then I need to think about quality on my production line. And here's the thing. Some of these are, they don't work together, and some of them can build together. Okay? So typically, when you're starting a new facility, you focus on quality first. Okay? And then when you get the quality right, then you start working on the time aspect of it, because now I can take time out of it. Now that I know how to do it and do it well, okay, maybe I can do it a little bit quicker. All right? Flexibility and cost do not necessarily go hand in hand. They don't always have to be mutually exclusive, but if you think about the more variety I offer on a production line, the more cost there is associated with it. When we started out with, when we did the production in Story City, and I first moved there, we did what was called, why can't I think of the name of it? Proline. Proline was they had 3 tiers of wood windows, right? They had custom, architect, designer, and Proline. So Proline is this kind of the lower end wood window that we offered, and we offered it to Lowe's, and it came in basically 3 colors. You could get it in brown, white, or tan, and that was it. Okay, but we produced a lot, and we could produce them quickly, and we could produce them at low cost. Okay, so in the 4 years I worked at that plant, we went from 3 colors to we then went to 9, and you could pick, so the 3 base colors, and we added 6 that were most popular that you could pick. Then we went from that 3 to 6 to 15, so now you can pick 15. Oh, and then by the way, now you can do custom color. And so now we go to almost an infinite number of SKU combinations with this custom color, and then the sizes were very specific. When we first started, we had like maybe 10 sizes, and then we went to, okay, well, you can do this many, and then we went to infinite. You can order exactly what you want. Well, what that does to a manufacturing environment is it means that if you're an operator in a production line, you have to make more decisions every single time. It's not, I'm making brown, white, and tan. It's I'm making an infinite number of colors, and I have to make sure I've got the right color. I'm making an infinite number of sizes. I've got to make sure I've got the right size. It's this, and you think about that, and it's not a big deal until you start to quantify it and say, seconds matter on a production line where you're trying to do low cost, right? And so now as an operator, instead of having almost no decisions, I have almost an infinite amount of decisions to make, how much that actually slows down the production line, right? And so that becomes, and I'll tell you, I think that's one of the reasons why the Story City plant closed, right? Because we went from this, we have a very focused strategy to know we're going to try to be everything to everybody, but we're still going to try to do it low cost, okay? And the other reason is, if you're in that marketplace, if you're in that market space, vinyl windows became very popular and kind of nudged that area out. People still do the higher end wood windows. I mean, that's still kind of a luxury in homes. But when you're in that lower space, vinyl windows are as efficient, if not more efficient, and so they nudge that out. But again, you have to be aware and conscientious about what's happening. What is it that you're competing on in the marketplace, and what is it that you're doing in your manufacturing environment? And then you have to try to protect that and control it. In terms of the process side of it, right, we're interested in cost, flow time, flexibility, and quality. Process cost is the total cost that's incurred in producing and delivering outputs. It includes the cost of raw materials, fixed and variable costs of operating the process. The process flow time is the total time needed to transform a flow unit from the input to an output. And it includes the actual processing time as well as any waiting time or flow unit spends in the buffers. Process flexibility is the ability of the process to produce and deliver the desired product variety. So depends on the flexibility of your resources. Okay. So again, you can have resources that perform multiple activities. A lot of times that trade-off here is, if you're in a flexible process environment and your volumes aren't high, you're talking about training people and having good flexible people. If you still are doing pretty high volumes, then you might be talking about investing in equipment that can do flexible things. But that equipment investment becomes less desirable the more rapid your product changes, right? Because you have less time to get the payoff out of the equipment. And your people that you're investing in their training, right, they can transition faster. So again, it has to do with, how do we tie these things together? If this is what my customer wants, what am I doing in my operationally to tie that together? And then process quality is the ability of the process to produce and deliver those quality products. It includes both process accuracy, can you be precise in what you're doing in the process, and are you conforming to the specifications of what your customer wants? So in terms of enabling successful performance, what should be the process design architecture? What metrics should we use to track, I think is what that should say, performance of a process? What policies govern that operation? How should process performance be controlled over time? And how should process improvements be performed? Okay, so process design decisions include, where is your plant location going to be? What capacity are you going to be trying to achieve? What's your product design? And what's your process design? And I have to tell you, when I sat in your shoes, I didn't get that there was a difference between product design and process design, and they're very different. right? You have engineers that focus on product design only, and you have engineers that focus on how do we make the equipment in the production lines. And they're usually two different groups of people, okay? Not that they don't work together, but they're typically two different groups of people, okay? And again, when I was in your shoes, I did not get that. And then when I went to work for Pella, it became very clear that they're different animals, okay? So resource choice and investment. Again, are you going to have people, more people? Are you going to do cross-training, right? Or are you going to buy equipment that's going to last for a number of years, but it's going to be more expensive? What's going to be the scale of your operation? I have a note here that I can contrast two different types of process design. So, if you think about a Toyota Corolla and a Ferrari, how they would be made very differently in those places, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to keep kind of moving through here. So in terms of metrics, right, managers have to identify what's measurable dimensions along which the performance of the process will be tracked. And again, you tie that to what's important to the customer. They were derived from customer expectations and what the company's strategic goals are. In terms of planning the process, you want to identify the targets for the various metrics and specify managerial policies that support the achievement of those targets. So what you should be hearing is this message is that it all needs to link together, right? Your customer, what your customer wants, what your process is doing, and how your management is setting up the policies that link those things together. So how many units of stock should be carried? Well, if you're a highly flexible environment in terms of the variety that you offer, you're going to have less stock of each SKU, maybe no stock of each SKU. Right? If you're doing things like for bicycles at Walmart, right, you can have higher, you're trying to do low cost, and so you're going to do large production runs, and so you might have more inventory. So at a call center, managerial policies specify the number of customer service representatives that should be available by time, by day, and by day of the week, right? So again, that way, or you think about McDonald's, how they staff. I'm sure at 2 o'clock in the morning, they don't have the same amount of staff that they do at lunchtime. Right? And so again, when we start to talk about policies, that's what we're talking about. How are we going to manage our people and our resources? Process control. What's the tactical aspect of the process management that's focused on continually ensuring in the short run the actual process performance conforms to the planned process performance? And then improvement. We have process improvement. Managers identify metrics that need to be improved on in the long run, and you work to make those changes, and you work to make them inherent. So when I first got to, sorry, I'm checking the time. When I first got to Murray here as a supply chain manager, on-time delivery was an issue. Like, we were supposed to be 98, 99%, and we were running about 89 or 90%. And my group that I managed was key in that, because the guy that was there before me, and this is a link about how metrics matter, he was measured on inventory turns, okay? And so his goal was to keep inventory very low, okay? But what happens is you have people that are working overtime, and you run them out of inventory, and they can't finish a production run, and so they have to go home at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, and oh, by the way, they have to come back on Saturday because now we have the product, right? How happy do you think those people are to be back on a Saturday, right? So that was one of the first things we did, is we fixed the fact that the supply chain group was running the plant out of parts, right? And it meant that my inventory turns measure went up, but you have to think about the bigger picture, right? What's the best thing for this plant, okay? And so then you can work on other areas of inventory turns, but let's not be running people out of parts. And so, we went within 3 months from being 80 to 90%, 88 to 90% right in there till we went 3 months in a row without any delinquents. And our plant manager, as an incentive, said, as the challenge, said he would shave his head if we were able to go 3 months without that. So between shifts, they took him out and set him up, and the barber came out and shaved his head for everybody. So, it's try to tie those things to a little bit of fun, too. But, again, that process improvement, you have to say what's important and how are you going to get there. Okay, so for optimal performance, those 5 questions that we address in 1.5 need to be addressed at both the inter-process and the inter-organizational level. All right, so we're getting right down to the end, which is good because we have about 2 minutes left. So we have 2 different types of process architectures. We have job shops and flow shops. Think about job shops I have a whole set of drilling machines over here, and I have a whole set of welding going on over here. And they go from, a big batch goes into the drilling, and then it goes from the drilling over to the welding. And that's batch processes. Okay, job shops are typically, they do big chunks of things that go through them. Flow shops, on the other hand, are the specialized resources. So think of a high volume production line. So instead of having a bunch of drills over here that do, so when I say large batches, I should say batches that come through there. They can be smaller batches because you typically do that when you have lower volume of things overall. Okay, but they come through in batches. What happens in a flow shop, if you think about each of these chairs as a different manufacturing workstation, in a flow shop it goes from, I do something here, I pass it here. I do something here, I pass it here. So that's the flow shop environment. Okay? And you typically have then specialized resources. So the vinyl plant here can produce, they can do up to 300 windows in an 8-hour shift, right? Nobody's sneezing on those production lines, right? Things are going like this. That's a flow shop. So I'm going from here to here to here, and I might have 15 lines in the plant, and each line has its own drill, has its own welding station, right? And it just goes through the production line that way. As opposed to here, I have a drill section and a welding section, and that's a job shop environment. So one of the things that's important is, depending on what your customer needs, you have to match your operational process to that. So if my customer needs, let's do this. Let me go back for just a quick second. If my customer needs high volume, should I have a job shop or flow shop set up in my operation? If I need a high volume production,
Flow shop.
I should have flow shop, right? If my customer needs more customization and less product offering, job shop, right? Okay, and then this last slide is just about the functional focus versus product focus. Functional focus is the job shop. The product focus is the flow shop. And then I'm just going to say you should review the summary on page 18 of the text. That's a good overview of the chapter. And other than that, happy Thursday, and I will see you back here on Tuesday. And don't forget, you've got 1A. There are 3 kind of short. They're about the product attributes, so make sure you get those done before Monday night at midnight. I have office hours Monday afternoon from 1:30 to 3:30. So if you've got questions, that's a great time, or email me.